Great. So my name is Joey Sullivan. I am the Natural Resources Management Intern at both Marsh-Billings-Rockefeller National Historical Park and St. Gaudens National Historical Park. Part of my role at the two parks is coordinating these Working Woodlands workshops, which are designed to connect nature enthusiasts and landowners with natural resource professionals to provide the skills and knowledge to promote land stewardship. So my role here is kind of the background work, setting up the topics, the presenters, and just making it happen. So today we have a webinar titled A Bird's Perspective on Healthy Forests. We're really grateful to have Jillian Liner, the Director of Conservation for Audubon Vermont, here to talk to us a little bit about some of the threats facing northeastern birds and what we can do to help them. So Jillian, if you want to take it from here, I'll stop sharing my screen and let you begin.
Great, thanks Joey. Hi everyone. Let us do a little swapping of screen sharing here. Can everyone see the presentation? Or Joey, can you guys see the presentation? Awesome, great. So hello again out there in virtual world. My name is Jillian Liner. I'm happy to be here speaking with you this afternoon. Joey mentioned I'm the Director of Conservation for Audubon Vermont, which is a relatively new position for me. I started in January, but Audubon's not new to me. I worked in a similar position in New York State previously. And if you saw in the chat, I'm still in New York State. I'm based in Ithaca, New York, and expecting to make the move up to Vermont this summer. And I've been with Audubon since 2001 in various roles in the conservation department. And before I get started with my talk, I also wanted to acknowledge two coworkers who are the true forest experts. Steve Hagenbu, who some of you may know, he's our forest lead in Vermont, and Suzanne Traeger, who's the forest program manager in New York, and she also works in Connecticut. And much of the information I'm sharing with you today, and even including some of the slides, are all based on their work and their efforts. So yeah, Steve and Suzanne are two awesome people that I'm fortunate to work with. So as mentioned, I'm going to be talking today about how forest management can improve habitat for forest birds, many species which are experiencing population declines. Audubon, just a quick overview of the talk. I'll talk a little bit about Audubon's Healthy Forest Initiative, the status of our forest bird populations, quality habitat for birds, kind of what that means, considerations for forest management to improve habitat, and then like Joey said, we'll have some time at the end for questions. And at any point, if my slides are off or they get stuck or you can't hear me, please speak up or send a little note in the chat that I believe Joey will be monitoring. So Audubon, a little bit more about Audubon. The Vermont office is a state office of the National Audubon Society, and there are 23 state programs, over 40 Audubon centers across the country. We work really closely with nearly 500 local independent Audubon chapters. And we also work with Maine Audubon, New Hampshire Audubon, Massachusetts Audubon, which are all independent Audubons. They're not affiliated with National Audubon, but we have common goals and shared priorities. And at National Audubon, our strategic initiatives focus around coasts, working lands, water, bird-friendly communities, and climate. And the Healthy Forest Program falls under our Working Lands Initiative. Our Healthy Forest Program, overall, it's striving to keep forests as forests. We did an analysis a number of years ago looking at forest characteristics and bird abundance, and we identified these large tracts of contiguous blocks of forest, which are a focus for our Healthy Forest Program. And you can see here on this slide the blocks that are up in Vermont and across the Northeast. And we work with land managers and stewards to conserve and improve forest health, quality, and resilience in these areas. No surprise that it's a priority for the Vermont office of Audubon. The healthy forest work is a priority because the majority of the state is forested, about 75% of the state. And about 19% of that is publicly owned. The rest is privately held. And there's a smaller percentage that is owned by the timber industry and other businesses. And the desire to protect forests and maintain them as healthy and resilient, it's not unique to Audubon. I think many people, probably all of you on this call, appreciate all the benefits that forests provide, including watershed protection and flood control and soil erosion prevention, carbon sequestration and storage, the numerous forest products that we benefit from, the incredible recreation opportunities that we have, the suite of wildlife and diverse wildlife that depend on those healthy forest habitats, and certainly the beauty of our forested landscape. And that includes, in terms of birds, a whole suite of forest birds that the Northeast and Vermont are truly unique in terms of the habitat that it provides to species like this beautiful Black-throated Warbler. And in fact, it's noteworthy in that the forests of Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, and New York are home to some of the greatest diversity of breeding birds in the continental US. And this image shows data from the Breeding Bird Survey, which is a long-term, large-scale avian monitoring program that was initiated in the 1960s to track the status and trends of birds. And you can see in this image that species richness, or the average number of forest birds per Breeding Bird Survey route, are shown. The areas with the highest number are the dark red, and sure enough, there we are in the Northeast in Vermont, supporting that incredible diversity of forest birds. And here are some of those birds. Vermont and the Northeast not only has this incredible diversity, but we actually support a large proportion of the global populations of a number of these species. And that's pretty significant from a conservationist perspective, because we have limited resources, and where we spend our resources trying to make a difference for these birds, it's pretty satisfying and awesome when we know that the impact that we're having is not necessarily just at a local scale, but on that global, like, population scale. And unfortunately, many of these forest birds are experiencing population declines. In fact, nearly a third of the 90 eastern forest bird species have experienced significant population declines over the past 50 years. And an example, the wood thrush has declined, the bird. I don't know if you guys can see my cursor. Can you see my cursor or no?
Can you try moving it again? And
it's okay if you can't.
yeah, I don't think we can see it.
Okay, that's okay. The bird with its mouth open in the upper left is a wood thrush. And that's a species that has declined 4% annually in Vermont since the 1960s. And if a trend like that continues, we would have a real chance that that species would disappear from our forests in the next 50 years. So these trends and declines are pretty well documented in research. And I don't know how many of you might have seen the study that came out a few years ago. Ken Rosenberg from the Lab of Ornithology was one of the lead authors, but there are a number of organizations and agencies that contributed to it. It was published in the Online Journal of Science, and it was one of the most robust synthesis of long-term population data ever assembled for animals. And it unfortunately found steep long-term losses across a number of groups of birds. Overall, it was close to 3 billion birds lost since the 70s, close to 30% of the migratory birds lost, and then 17% of eastern forest birds. And I'll add, for those of you who haven't seen this, and I think Joey will include a link in the chat, and if we don't include them, we'll send them later. So some links to some additional resources that you all can follow up on after the talk. But not all birds were documented to be declining as part of this study. For example, waterfowl and raptors and even turkeys have not seen declines like that. And I think that reflects just the commitment among conservationists and government to address threats and invest in those groups of birds has resulted in those populations being maintained, sustaining, and in some cases even increasing. And so that's reason to give us hope, right? Because you could read a study like this and be pretty depressed, but I think those looking at the successes that we have had in bird conservation motivate us and allow us to remain, optimistic and hopeful that we can make a difference for these birds. And when we think about in what ways, what are the threats that they are facing and what ways can we address those threats and make a difference? Here are some of the threats that these species are facing. And it's even in places like Vermont and the Northeast where we feel like, gosh, when you look past 100 years, we have more forest now than we did then. Like, how could our forest birds not be doing well? And of course, we don't have these birds up here all the time. They do spend, part of their life cycle, part of the year in other places. But the time that they are here during the breeding season is so critical. I mean, that's the time when populations, when birds are able to reproduce young and raise their families successfully, that's what's allowing their populations to be sustained and then also withstand threats or catastrophic events. So even though they are only up here for a short amount of time, it's a really important part of their life. So, and even though we have lots of forested habitat, we feel like forest has come back. Our forests are still facing a loss of habitat from forest parcelization and conversion to non-forest uses. In fact, just recently in Vermont, it was noted that in the first time in over 100 years, we're actually losing forest habitat. Our forests are being fragmented, and fragmentation, for those who aren't familiar with the edge effect, when you fragment forest, it creates more forest edge, which is the abrupt transition from forested habitat to non-forest, so ag areas or developed areas. And often that creates this really easy pathway for predators like raccoons and cats and skunks to predate on nesting birds. It also increases nest parasitism by brown-headed cowbirds, which I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with that bird, but it's a bird. Its life strategy is to go in and lay its eggs in other birds' nests and then continue on its way, so it doesn't have to spend the resources raising its young. And their young, that the nests they choose, their young are often bigger, and so they outcompete the birds that they've actually laid their eggs in. They outcompete their chicks. And birds are also facing pressure from or impacts from non-native and invasive pests and plants. In fact, some invasive species can become so abundant on the forest floor that they prevent forest regeneration. And also they reduce the understory, kind of the structure in the forest, which I'll talk more about in a little bit, that certain bird species depend on. And even things like overabundant deer can impact forest regeneration. And then there's obviously forest pests like emerald ash borer and hemlock woolly adelgid, which can impact birds by altering the forest composition and affecting the birds that might have a particular habitat association with certain tree species. And then climate change, we're experiencing a loss of insect diversity and abundance, which are the major prey base to breeding birds. And then climate change is introducing new threats and compounding existing threats. And many of these threats that I just described alter the quality of the habitat. So even though we look out at our landscape and we see so much forest, in order for that forest to provide what it needs to provide to birds, it needs to be quality habitat. And so that's a big emphasis of our Healthy Forest Initiative, finding ways to promote healthy quality habitat for birds. And it's also good to keep in mind that we might categorize a whole bunch of birds as forest birds because they're associated with forest habitat. But different birds are associated with different types of forest and even different aged classes of forests. And they, and many will use a range, for when they're spending time in our forest. So we have species like the prairie warbler, the towhee that prefer to nest in young forests. Then we have species on the far right, like the scarlet tanager and the wood thrush, that tend to prefer to nest in mature forests. So forests that are over 50 age and have a closed canopy. And then we have species that will use both, like the parula and the grosbeak. And so in addition, we have birds that we think of as mature forest birds, and they nest, we call them that because they nest in the mature forest. But then once they're young, fledge, that is once they're young hatch and they leave the nest, they move their families to areas that are more open and shrubby to raise their young. And then the reverse is true, where we have birds that nest in shrubby open areas, but then once the young fledge, they move them all to more mature forest. And so again, understanding the suite of birds and how they use our forests and the different forest types and the different age class, all are considerations for, okay, when we look out at our forests, how can we manage in a way and improve the habitat for birds? And that becomes a big emphasis of what we promote when we talk about quality habitat. That is, diversity is key. We want to see diverse forest species, structure, etc. I'm going to talk about this in a little bit. And we look at it both through the landscape, at the landscape level, and also the stand or more localized level. And we see an incredible opportunity when we think back to the slide, one of my first slides that I shared that mentioned, 75% of Vermont is forested and about 80% of that is privately owned. And then we recognize the opportunity to mobilize landowners and land managers and other natural resource professionals to promote the healthy and diverse forest, and the role that all of those partners, including you, can play in this. And you might think, well, gosh, I only own, 3 acres, or I only own 20 acres. I'm not a big landowner, but you can influence an entire landscape. Obviously, the impact depends on the size of the property. And if you have a large, 500 acres, there's a lot you could be doing that. You could be managing that 500 acres in many different ways that would be benefiting and not only birds, but other wildlife, and meeting other goals that you have for your property. But even managing a smaller property can have a positive impact at the landscape scale. So if we take a look at this next slide, say you owned that little patch of conifers right there in the square, the red rectangle there. We always encourage landowners or land managers, when they're thinking about what can I do on my property, to think big, look beyond just your property and consider the role of your property in that larger landscape, because birds and other wildlife think that way too. So you think about what's around you, who owns it, how is it being managed, is it being managed? And so if you owned, like in this picture, a group of conifers that are clearly unique in that landscape, they're lacking from the surrounding area, there's good reason why we want to see those maintained, because they provide a really important habitat component for wildlife. They're important thermal cover during the winter for wildlife, but they're also used by nesting birds like Blackburnian and black-throated green warblers. In addition to kind of getting that landscape context, what's around me? Is it mature forest? Is it young forest? Do I have something super unique that's not in the surrounding landscape? There are several stand level, or, again, more local habitat conditions that we promote and that can be promoted through forest management. And they're very applicable to small properties or woodlots. And I'm going to run through some of those now. One is promoting species diversity. native vegetation provides the most habitat value to wildlife. And we always advocate for a diversity of native trees, shrubs, vines, herbaceous plants to increase the suitable habitat for forest birds. The native plants support all or part of life cycles of our native insects, which I mentioned earlier are the primary food source for the majority of our forest bird species during the breeding season. In addition, native trees and shrubs produce nutritious mass, so fruits, seeds, and nuts, when compared to non-natives, actually more nutritious mass. We always strive to manage interfering vegetation that might be preventing the growth of native trees and shrubs. And we find overall managing the diversity of native plants ensure that the birds have the available food and the different species will increase the chances of some food sources from every year to year. Vertical structural diversity is really important. And this is the layering of vegetation. So when you look out at a forest, we call this, we want to see the wall of green. We don't want it to be like a park-like setting. We want to see multiple canopy layers because that's highly beneficial to many forest breeding birds. And there are ways that you can manage to help facilitate this wall of green. In fact, there are many, this graphic is trying to demonstrate that. I mentioned earlier in the talk how different forest birds have slightly different habitat preferences, and they can be found in different layers of the forest. There are some birds that nest and spend most of the time way up high in the canopy. There's other forest birds, like an ovenbird, that actually nests on the ground. There's some birds that are found and have a preference for mid-story. And so it's really important to have this this vertical diversity. And then there are some forest birds that really prefer a more open canopy, open setting and younger forest. And so finding ways and working with your forester to manage and maintain and promote this diversity is really, really important for our suite of forest birds. We like to retain large diameter trees. These trees offer nest sites, perches, and places to forage for a number of birds like hawks, red-shouldered hawks, broad-winged hawks. And they also tend to have large trees with cavities or large dead branches enhance the habitat for many forest birds. So wherever possible, we like to retain a component of large diameter trees. And if not present, to be thinking about the management you can be doing to leave certain trees that will become those large diameter wildlife trees in the future. When possible, retaining or promoting at least some softwoods where they occur, especially in predominantly hardwood forests, is very important. Even a small cluster can have high value to birds. I mentioned earlier some of the species that sort of hone in on softwoods, blue-headed vireos, black-throated greens, species like that. And this probably, for any of you who are birders, won't surprise you that promoting dead standing trees or snags to provide locations for nesting and roosting and foraging for insects is valuable. And cavities of all sizes, big trees, little trees. And we do have recommendations on how many per acre of a range of size, which in some situations could seem like a lot, but it's what we're striving for if possible. And there are ways that you can work with a forester, or you can manage your woods in a way to promote and create future snags. Down woody material. It's exactly what it says. Material just on the ground, coarse woody materials, so big, things that are over 3 feet in length and 10 inches in diameter, and also just finer woody material enhances habitat for forest birds. These provide locations where birds can seek cover, they can perch, they can nest, they can forage. And large logs are really important for drumming displays of the ruffed grouse. And an added benefit of leaving down wooded material is it has been found that in areas where deer densities are excessively high, they can create an obstacle that prevent deer from being able to eat all the seedlings and saplings. So in summary, the best management practices for birds, if you're a forest landowner or you're interested in managing your forest in a way that benefits wildlife, first thing to do is to contact a forester to help get a plan done for your property. And a plan would help assess what the current conditions are and help make recommendations to meet your objectives and plan for the future health of your forest. And if wildlife and birds are a priority for you, you can consult with a wildlife biologist. Actually, Audubon, again, I mentioned Steve Hagenbu has done a lot of assessments in Vermont and worked with landowners and their foresters to help provide additional technical assistance and recommendations. We also have a program where we are training foresters in managing for birds, and foresters can enroll in this endorsement program where they get a series of trainings and a couple steps. And then once they go through that, they can be endorsed by Audubon, and we can make recommendations of foresters that are endorsed or that we've been working closely with to help develop a plan for your property. Obviously, like what I talked about, thinking about the landscape is really important, not just your property. It is part of your property is just one piece of this larger puzzle that is our landscape, our forested landscape. We want to strive to bring the landscape in balance in terms of successional stages of forest. So appreciating that there are benefits to different aged forests, early successional habitat, so shrubby, young saplings, that early successional habitat is really important to some breeding birds that nest there, but even birds that nest in more mature forests that come to those areas post-fledging. Obviously, limiting any management activities during the breeding season to prevent the disturbance to nesting birds. Retaining key features, the conifers, tree species diversity, snags, downwoody, debris, etc. And using management like small cuts or creating gaps and openings that increase the vertical structure in stands where it is lacking. We do have, I want to also make sure everyone's aware, we have a number of resources online. I'm showing here this image of the forest management, the guide for foresters. We actually have a companion and it's for New York birds, but there's a lot of relevant information. We have a companion one that's for private landowners. So online, you can download the PDF, the Forester's Guide or the Landowner Guide. Again, it captures a lot of what I went over today, but provides more detail in terms of even down to actual silvicultural prescriptions that would achieve what we're striving to see on the landscape. And then on the Audubon Vermont website, we also have a number of resources that are available. And with that, I thank everyone for your attention, and we can see I have not seen the chat, so I don't know if anyone's asked questions, but Joey, we can open it up to questions.
Really, do you want to stop sharing your screen, Jillian, so we can see everybody?
Did that work?
Yep. All right. Let's see. Okay, I'm gonna just go through the chat. But yeah, thank you so much, Jillian, for your presentation. That was really great. I know I learned a lot. Hope everyone else learned a lot from that too. So the first question so far is perhaps a silly question. There are no such things as silly questions. How do you define a forest bird? Lives primarily in a forest versus a field or other landscape?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And some people might define it differently. A forest, when I think of forest bird, it is a bird that breeds. I'm specifically thinking of breeding. So when they're up here, breeding and breeds in a forested habitat type. That includes, though, like a range. I talked about not a grassland, not a wetland, not a muddy area, but there are birds that are considered forest birds that nest in shrubby areas. And actually those same birds, so, and it could be an ag area and there's shrubs, and you'll find towhees, you'll find blue-winged warblers, and you'll think, oh, that's not a forest bird, that's a shrub bird. But that shrubs stage is actually just kind of the first successional stage of transitioning into a forest. And if you're in a predominantly forested landscape, so big trees, and say there's a blowdown or some sort of major insect infestation that kills a bunch of trees that drop, or there's forest management that removes a bunch of trees and it starts to regrow, you'll find those same forest birds occupying and breeding those areas. So a forest bird is any bird that breeds in the forest, except the suite of habitat associated with forest is anything from shrub to mature forest. That was a really long answer, but.
Oh, that was a great answer. That I feel like really explained it well. I actually have a quick question to add in. I hear the terms woodlot or woodland and forest used sometimes interchangeably and sometimes in different scenarios. Do you think you could speak to maybe the difference between those two words?
I don't think I can speak to how everybody might refer to them differently. I know how I might. I mean, forest, sometimes I do think more generally like large swaths of forest versus somebody who owns, say, 50 acres and some of it's ag, and they have a wood lot that's 20 acres or 10 acres. But sometimes, I mean, when I speak with land managers and stewards, sometimes they just have, we'll say, my wood lot or my woodlands versus, or the forest I have, or, so they just use it interchangeably. But I kind of tend to think of forest as like the bigger swath of areas, but I use them interchangeably.
Yeah, no, thanks. Yeah, I've heard different uses of it and was just curious how your thoughts on that. Thank you. So I also was putting in those links, Jillian. So for everyone, when Jillian was kind of mentioning a further resource, if you scroll through the chat, you'll see links to those. And I can also send those out in an email as a follow-up, just a reminder. So there's a question from Jane that says forest water. Jane, if you could elaborate maybe on what your question is with that.
I wonder, are you thinking, do we consider floodplain forests as forests, or did I misspeak?
Jane, if you want to unmute yourself, feel free. We'll give her a second to maybe,
sure,
if she's putting it in the chat. But the next question, Jillian, is there an Audubon guide for where or how to place nest boxes?
We do have information online for nest boxes. And even, actually, there was just an article that came out because this is the time of year where a lot of people are thinking about getting their nest boxes back up. So we could include links to that, Joey, as well. And the Lab of Ornithology also has an extensive website about nest box and a nest box program. And obviously a really important thing with nest boxes is making sure that once you put them out, you maintain them and maintain them in a way that promotes native species, not starlings. But but yeah, we can provide information on that and what's suitable and what situations, bluebirds, swallows, etc.
Sure, yeah, if you want to send me some good resources, Jillian, I can pass it on to the participants. So it looks like Jane followed up. Management of forest water beyond don't pollute. We have been hearing it is best to slow down the flow. Other advice?
Okay, let me make sure I understand that question. Manage of forest water beyond dark pollution. So you're thinking about managing in terms of like creeks and rivers and such through a forested landscape? I mean, okay, let me just try to respond to this, even though I might not quite have it right. There's no doubt that, especially with climate change and experiencing more severe weather events, flooding, fluctuations, like for example, just this past week, there was past couple of weeks, we have snow cover, but then it warms up really quickly and there's a tremendous amount of runoff. There are efforts to restore forests to certain areas in an attempt to provide places where water can essentially be slowed down and trapped. I mean, this is similar to the creating vegetated or even treed riparian areas, but also buffers where water can, in a lot of areas where, especially if it's ag, there are places where berms were created to prevent rivers and creeks from being able to spill over the banks because they didn't want their ag fields to be flooded. And so there are situations where those berms are being taken down, leveled, so that when water level rises really much, it can spill over into these fields and slowly, I mean, a lot of those areas were wetlands in the past, and those that can be places where water is absorbed during more severe storm events or melting events. And so that actually is really important. I mean, that's going to help not only create habitat and enhance habitat, but reduce flooding events to communities and downstream. So I don't know, Jean, if that's exactly what you're getting at, but that is something that is important to do and beneficial.
Yeah, great. I think that covered it well, Jillian. And I will say, so next month, we are not finalized, but we are planning on doing workshops around a theme of riparian tree buffers and planting. So if that's an interest of you, we'll be reaching out with information about that.
Great.
So the next question.
I see one of the, yeah, I see Joey. Mark had a question about sort of, I'm assuming it's like grappling with, am I going to try to do something for every single bird, or is there a bird or two that I should focus on managing for? And I would say, obviously, it depends in terms of what opportunities you might have on your property. And certainly if you have an opportunity to make a difference for a really, really rare bird, that's something that should be considered. And often though, we find there are ways, and the management recommendations that we're making can benefit multiple species. And again, not only birds, but other wildlife. So I think that's something, when having an understanding of what might be on your property, or perhaps what could be on your property, would help narrow in on that. But typically we find ways to promote management that benefits multiple species.
Great, thank you. So the next question from Jim is, are there best management practices which include introducing new plants and trees or ground cover plants in the interest of promoting greater diversity or developing a quote unquote wall of green?
Wait, now I got it. Can you say that again?
Yeah, so are there any best management practices that essentially involve introducing new plants or trees to create that wall of green?
Well, so often what creates the wall of green is introducing light to the forest floor. That's what stimulates the growth. And so that's kind of the easiest way. There are some shade intolerant species that maybe could be grown, and or if you have, for example, some sort of understory that's dominated by an invasive, just managing that invasive species can open it up where other native species could be planted and that would grow successfully. So it's possible, often though it's the light, and light is an important factor for, you know, seeing that growth and encouraging that wall of green.
Great, thank you. So the next question from Michelle is, do you think ideal bird or wildlife management is compatible with the current use program? I think we can do a better job of management without doing the prescribed logging.
So I'm not as familiar with Vermont's current use program, that is to say how much is required in terms of logging, you know, how much needs to be removed to be part of the current use. I will, from our perspective, management is a really important tool. So logging, removing, and it doesn't, I mean, even in some situations, small, depending on what's there and the condition of it, even small, what's considered clear cuts, so pretty heavy removals can be beneficial. So I don't know, again, the requirements and if it's really extreme, because I'm not that familiar yet with Vermont's current use program, but in New York, certainly the management recommendations that we recommend are compatible with the New York program in New York that was similar. I will say some of our policy, we're very involved in promoting policies that help protect forests and forest health. And I do know there are some conversations in Vermont right now about modifying the current use program such that properties that maybe have really unique features or unique areas, steep slopes, et cetera, they can still be considered part of the program for maintaining and protecting those areas. So Michelle, I don't know if that kind of gets at your question too. Again, because I don't know sort of the degree that's required to be a part of that program.
And it looks like Sabina put in a note in the chat that there were just updates passed for the current use program, which would now permit retention of trees as part of a management plan. Thank you, Sabina, for including that.
Yeah, thank you.
So the next question is, how does DWM keep deer from getting to saplings, etc.?
If there's enough of it down and it's kind of messy, like super messy woody debris that's like fallen down, it would be like if you ever walked in the woods and you saw a blowdown or something like that. If you leave a bunch of material down there, the deer actually, they can try to stomp through there, but there will be enough light that can get down there that saplings are able to grow, but it's tricky enough for the deer to be able to manage and navigate to get in there and eat every little thing. Where when the forest doesn't have that, the deer can just go through and munch. So it's like a barrier. It's not perfect. And actually Cornell's research forest is currently investigating kind of walls of coarse woody material and almost like down sort of fencing to see if even that could stop, not only help create growth, but actually be more like a natural fencing to prevent deer from getting into certain areas.
Oh, that's interesting. I'd be curious to see those results of that experiment. So the next question from Jim is, can you comment on the importance of ponds, natural beaver, man-made for bird habitats?
Yeah, really important, because in fact, those are some of the areas that a lot of the management recommendations that we suggest are just mimicking natural disturbances. And beavers basically create a natural disturbance in a forested system. And you'll see areas where beavers have dammed and where beavers live, you'll find a lot of that shrubby habitat. And a lot of those shrub forested birds are found in those areas. So they are creating some of that habitat.
Great, thank you. So the next question from Jim is there any hope for expanding the range of whippoorwills back to where it was 60 years ago?
That, yeah, that would take a lot of work. I'm not sure, actually, Jim, or are they even up in Vermont in anywhere? I mean, we barely have any whippoorwills in New York State.
I can answer that. As a kid, I used to listen to them around my home in southern Vermont, and they are no longer anywhere near here. There are just a few spots.
Yeah, that would be just with the amount of forest cover that currently exists. And they are in a few places in New York State, and there are more open farmed areas. So I don't think it would ever be back to the point that it was. It's always like striking a balance. I have conversations with people about grassland birds too. So grassland birds actually are doing worse than forest birds. They are really tanking. And I always want to try to figure out a place for everyone on the landscape, if it makes sense for us to be promoting it. Grassland birds, which typically had their populations in the Midwest, have lost, and there's with agricultural practices, no chance of them coming back. And some of their ranges has shifted a little bit to the Northeast. And I feel like if we can find places to sustain them where they are now and maintain them, let's do that and do it in balance with forest. But there are some people who would argue against that, saying, no, all of Vermont should be forest and some wetlands or open habitat or open water. So yeah, I don't think, given where we are currently, we'll ever revert back to what it might have looked like 60 years ago. But yeah, and whippoorwill, I don't think of it as there's woodcock and other species that are on the radar, and I feel like the recommendations we're making, but might even need a reintroduction.
Great, thank you. So the next question from Jeff is, what is the optimum habitat for gold-winged warbler?
A golden-winged warbler. Yeah, Mark Labar should be on this call. Mark Labar is a conservation biologist with Audubon Vermont, and a large part of his work is maintaining habitat for golden-winged warblers. They so they can be found in, they're often associated with forests, but they like patches of shrub habitat with a few standing trees remaining. So they can be found in ag areas with shrubby habitat. It doesn't have to be adjacent to forest habitat, but they're one of the birds that more recently they are finding that once they fledge their young, they go to a nearby patch of forest. And in New York, we have golden-winged warblers in heavily forested landscapes that just have patches of shrubs. So kind of the opposite of like the Champlain Valley, which is very ag and open, and then patches of shrubs. And there are forests nearby, but that's a very different landscape than some of the places where they're found, which is predominantly forest with a big patch of early successional or shrub habitat in that. But they typically our recommendation is to leave some standing trees in those open areas.
Great, thank you. So the next question is from Doug. It's a little bit lengthy, Jillian. Do you want to read it on your own?
Sure. So without, Doug, are you in Vermont?
Yes, we're in East Central Vermont.
Yeah, without actually seeing your property, it's hard to say, even given the description, like if it's the best, but I'll reflect on some of the things that you mentioned. So again, and you would probably even know better having just seen the presentation, in terms of if the forested habitat you have has the structural diversity that's would be super desirable. If you're surrounding the surrounding 200 acres, are they managed? Are they not?
Unmanaged.
They're unmanaged. Okay. And what do they look like? Do they look like a park-like forest, or, you know?
Oh, no, it's nice wild woodland.
Yeah. So I would think the questions too would be, are there any invasive species? Are there any potential like pests? Do you have the dead standing trees? Like all those questions to see, is there more that you could be doing? Not necessarily heavily managing your forest, but just, you know, the small modifications that you could be making. And then in terms of the meadows, it depends on the size. If you don't have, if those are relatively small, I'm assuming?
No.
Oh,
No,
they're big.
I think probably about 6 acres plus of meadow.
Yeah. That sounds like my house sometimes.
That's not
Jane.
me.
I don't think Jane realizes that she came off mute as she's chasing her dogs. But and then the meadows would be, you know, is there a hard edge from the meadow to the forest? Or do you have kind of a transition of forest to shrub to
It's
meadow?
a really wonderful transition, actually. It's great.
I mean, that sounds pretty good. That
I
does.
think so.
good.
The only thing, I think one of the reasons I'm asking this question is once in a while, somebody will come at my behest to see about cutting down a fall. And they want to cut down so much. And I say, no, 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 we want a natural forest. And I'm quite happy with the falls to lay where they are. And just let the wildlife benefit from it, all the life.
Yep, that is, yeah, it sounds like what you're doing is working. And it's certainly, if you listen to a talk like this and you're like, check, check, check.
Yes, and thank you for an excellent presentation.
You're welcome.
Great. Thanks, Doug and Jillian. That's good conversation. So Sabina left another note. There were just updates
cool.
passed for the current use program, which would, yep. And then for more information, see Vermont State Legislator H-697 current use changes. All right. Yeah, thanks, Sabina, for putting that in there. I can include that in the follow-up email if I find kind of the link or more information for that. Appreciate
Jim, did
it.
you see Sabina said she had a whippoorwill pass through in 2021?
Oh, no, I didn't see that.
Drawing that to Jim's
Oh,
attention.
that's super exciting. Very cool. And then Charlotte said she heard a whippoorwill in mid-Vermont about 25 years ago, but none since. Yeah. So the next question from Jim is, does feeding birds help other than inviting birds closer to where we can see them?
So feeding birds isn't as critical during the breeding season. A lot of birds have plenty of food resources during the breeding season. And not all birds, you know, they predominantly feed on insects during that time of year, which are really protein rich. And some of the birds, you know, won't come to feeders, right? There's only certain bird species that will. I think bird feeding can be a beneficial food source during times of year when, you know, they don't have as much food available to them. And it is an incredible way to engage with birds and get to know them. So.
Great, thank you. So Sabina left another comment. For those in Vermont, Vermont Coverts is a great resource for learning more about how to manage woodlands for wildlife. Yeah, thank you for putting that in there, Sabina. So Vermont Coverts as well as Vermont Woodlands Association are both co-sponsors of these workshops. So they'll be putting on lots of workshops of a similar topics as we're talking about today. So encourage you to check out their websites. I'll throw in the Vermont Woodlands Association link as well. And it looks like Michelle put in a link from a article about the adjustments to the current use program. Oh, thank you for doing that, Michelle. So yeah, if anyone's interested in that, please check out the link that Michelle just put in the chat. I'm going to throw in the Vermont Woodlands Association link as well. Awesome. So it looks like we've got through all of the questions. If anyone has any more lingering questions, please put it in the chat now, or you can unmute yourself if you'd like. We've got about 3 minutes left. Yeah, thank you guys for coming. This is, we do this for you guys. So seeing you all come today and all the other workshops is great. We're really excited about this and excited about what we can offer in the future. So next month, I mentioned it briefly, we're thinking about a riparian tree planting workshop. So a virtual one, but we're also planning a potential tree planting event at the Ottaquechee River Trail in Woodstock, Vermont. More information to come out about that. We're still kind of planning out the logistics, but putting that seat out there now. So registrations come early for that because I imagine it'll fill up pretty quick. And yeah. And thank you again, Jillian. This was incredible. Really appreciate it.
No problem. My pleasure. Thanks, everyone. Hopefully I'll see you someday in Vermont.
Thank you very much, both of you, all of you.
Yes, thank you all. This was great. All right, have a great rest of your weeks, everyone. And I'll send out the links to the recording.
Great. Thanks.
Bye, Jillian.